I feel like for some reason I don't talk about creationism very much anymore. That used to be kind of my bread and butter, but then I don't know, lost interest for a while, switched on to other stuff. But you know what? I think it's time to start getting back to my roots a little bit more often. So here we have some kind of Christian talk show. I don't know if it's a show on like actual TV on one of those dime a dozen Christian channels, or if it's just an internet thing. Who cares? Doesn't matter. It's the typical junk regardless. Anyway, there's a guest on here who's a creationist, who's here to deny evolution, whose arguments make him sound like he was born in the early 19th century. He appears to have no intellectual connection to the modern world whatsoever. And I'm not saying his arguments would have held water back then. They still would have been awful, but at least they would have been somewhat relevant. So the host asks what the guest thinks of people who think evolution is an undeniable fact.
Well, I've met some of them when I was at the University of Arkansas. There were 5 atheistic biology professors who came and occupied the first row.
When you were doing a presentation?
When I was doing my presentations.
And I want to stop this right here and say a couple things about the video right up front. This whole video was covered over with annoying inspirational music. I've taken that out. Sometimes that might affect the audio, cut out little bits of people speaking. Nothing too major. There are subtitles. I did not put those in. They're baked into the video, and they're often wrong. In fact, whoever did these subtitles, assuming a human did them at all, even spelt the guest's name wrong. His name is Dr. Pundit with an A, but the subtitles have it as Dr. Pundit with a U. Now, this is on what's claimed to be the host's official YouTube channel, but then the channel's full of just random clips of Christian apologists and Joe Rogan clips. You would think if it was the official channel of this guy, the host, it would be mostly videos of him, but no. For all I know, maybe this is a fake official channel. That'd be pretty much par for the course with YouTube these days. But anyway, yeah, if you see a bunch of typos, ignore them. That's not me.
And they told me, evolution is a fact.
Oh, did they? And what did you say to prompt that response? Evolution's just a theory. Nobody has any real idea if it's true or not at all. It's just a total guess. That'd be my guess. That's usually what it is.
So I said, all right, that's your theory. Will you allow another theory at all?
And the answer was, of course, yes, if you present an alternative theory that better explains the full breadth of the current evidence. The difficulty being, of course, that you guys never actually do that or even really try. And in fact, I hate to prejudge here, but you're a creationist. I suspect you don't even understand what it would actually mean to try.
Or are you going to stick right there? They said, we don't mind looking at another theory.
And I'm sure they wouldn't mind if you're right there in front of them. It's probably not going to take long. They'll sniff out extremely fast if you got nothing.
So I said, all right, let's look at your theory.
Wait, I thought you wanted to present another theory. Why are you looking at their theory? I guess I shouldn't jump to conclusions, because I was taking it for granted that the idea here is that everybody involved supposedly already understands their theory, which is why you're talking about alternatives.
Let's take the book, Origin of Species, which you're supposed to base all your statements on.
Oh no. All right, well, after the last clip, my assumption was you just wouldn't understand their theory. I thought that was going to be the problem here. But no. Apparently, the actual problem is that you don't understand even the most basic idea of what science is at all. The origin of species is the scripture of biology. Modern biologists are supposed to base all their statements on a book laying out the groundwork of an idea in 1859. You've just disqualified the possibility of there being any reason to ever listen to you. So presumably at this point, this gaggle of biologists laughed in your face and left. And that's the end of the story, right?
And let's ask ourselves some questions on the theory itself.
Okay. In a discussion of the theory itself, as of presumably the 21st century, I assume that's when this story takes place, we're a quarter century in the 21st century, very rarely is discussion of the theory at the level of a professional biologist going to involve Charles Darwin's book in any way. Yeah, that book is highly relevant in a historical sense, and if you're talking about the history of biology, it's gonna come up. If you're teaching people who are new to the subject, it's also gonna come up. But you're trying to talk to these professional biologists about the current state of scientific understanding. The fact that you would immediately bring up the origin of species and portray that as representing the theory in the present is beyond comical.
And if you realize when you look at the book, how Charles Darwin has stated it out, he destroys his own theory in his book.
Great. Well, I have two things to say about that. First, no. Second, who cares?
Very few people have actually read the book. Do you know that?
Many, many people have read the book. It's probably one of the most read books in the history of science.
Both in the Christian and the believing world, and those who are in the evolutionary world.
The Christian world and the evolutionary world. Do you have to pick one? Seems to me an awful lot of people don't think you have to pick one.
99.5% of them have never read the book.
Oh, so basically of just people overall, most people haven't read the book? Well, yeah, if you're just talking people in general, of course, most of them probably haven't read the book. Most people don't read science books for fun. But regardless, as these things go, it's a very widely read book. To say that very few people have read it is just not accurate. I mean, be real, most Christians, just average Joe Christians, probably haven't even sat down and read the Bible cover to cover. Apathy prevails, but you would never say as just a general fact that very few people have read the Bible. Or take Harry Potter. You know how many people read Harry Potter? You know how many copies of that book sold? The first one? It's one of the best-selling books of all time. You say that name, everyone knows what it is. You know how many copies that sold? According to Wikipedia, like 120 million, which is roughly like 1.5% of people. The number of people who actually read it is probably a little higher if you factor in libraries and shared copies and used copies and pirated PDFs, but still very much a minority of people. Barely anyone read Harry Potter, very unpopular book.
That is one of the reasons I really felt I need to read that book. And by the way, you can't just read the book once and you understand it all. I had to read it 5 times.
Seriously? Darwin doesn't exactly mince words. It's not Heidegger or Hegel or something. If you're telling the truth and you actually felt like you had to read it 5 times just to understand what was being said, that does not reflect well on your level of reading comprehension. And yet the way you say this, it almost sounds like a brag. Almost as if you're trying to say that even among the people who've read it, most of them didn't understand it, because you have to read it a bunch of times to understand the point, and so you're one of the very few people who's read it enough times to really understand.
5 times. Cover to cover. Then I realized, now I got what Darwin is saying.
Well, I'm glad you felt like you finally cracked the code, but again, it's really not that kind of book. This should not have been a problem. The only thing I could see legitimately posing this kind of impediment is if you're not used to the writing style because you haven't been exposed very much to 19th century writing. In the intervening time between then and now, the way people typically write has changed quite a bit. And by the way, the fact that so much time has elapsed that the writing style of this book feels so old-fashioned should probably give you a hint as to how relevant it actually is to bring this up in a discussion of modern science with current-day biologists. Oh, and by the way, is this still you talking to the biologists? Like you're telling them all of this? I had to read the book 5 times to even understand what the hell was going on. Are they still there listening to you, entertaining this nonsense, or are you just talking to yourself at this point?
And then when you look at that, then I started underlining here and a point over there in the book.
How dare you desecrate evolution's holy scripture? That was handed down by nature itself to Darwin, peace be upon him.
And when went back and forth, I realized he has broken down his own theory in his book.
Again, no, and again, who cares? But at this point, there's a cut to a later point in the show, so I guess that was the end of the story. Very Shaggy Doggish. You just kind of rambled on about something, kind of lost the plot, and then stopped. No point, no punchline, so now we'll move on.
Any other questions? Right over there.
How did Darwin...
Oh my god! No way! No way do you have a studio audience for this! How do you have a studio audience? I thought this was like somebody's living room or something. Like in that Seinfeld episode where Kramer has a talk show in his apartment. How do you have people sitting there watching this? Who is volunteering to come and watch some crappy Christian talk show? Live in person? And okay, yeah, there's not many of them there. There's like a dozen people or whatever. But this implies that you have space for something approaching an actual studio, which implies some amount of a budget, which implies somebody's paying for this. Just set your money on fire, why don't you? Okay, sorry, random lady, I interrupted you there with my exclaiming of things.
How did Darwin contradict himself?
Here's one of the ways he contradicted himself. One, he started his book with the first chapter.
As you do. Actually, now that I think about it, I think there's an introduction as well. Even this is wrong.
Which is variations under domestication. That means in the breeding experiments, all right?
No, it means under domestication. So yes, it has to do with breeding, the changes that have occurred over time through historical breeding of plants or animals, but that's not experiments, that's just people breeding for characteristics that they prefer. That's the main thrust of the chapter, so I don't know where you're getting this idea that the main point of it is breeding experiments. You say you read this 5 times?
Then he took all those principles. By the way, there was nothing in nature, that's why he went there.
Nothing in nature what? Most of the book is about stuff in nature, evidence from things in nature to support his theory. As you say, what he was doing was taking a principle, which he derived from his understanding of how selective pressure can influence organisms under conditions of domestication over time, and applying that to nature analogically. And then he spends an entire book explaining why it seems to him that that analogy is applicable. So what do you mean there's nothing in nature? What are you hoping to see in nature, or for him to have mentioned seeing in nature, that you would have counted as something? Something in what sense?
He went to the breeding principles and looked at all the breeding principles and simply took the whole amount and put it into nature. And he said, now, nature is how it happened. This is how it happened. And that's the theory of evolution.
That's the best you can do after reading the book 5 times? You really think that's an adequate summary? I think you should have read it 5 or 10 more times.
But here's the catch. In the question of breeding, he will tell you over and over again in his own book that the fundamental basic ingredient, if you want to call it that ingredient, in breeding is the breeder. You take him off, you have no breeding.
Wait a second. Are you doing the painting requires a painter, the building requires a builder thing? Is that where this is going? A breed requires a breeder. Yes, of course, when humans act as breeders, Darwin is very aware that a human is the breeder. But the point of the idea he's talking about is that there are conditions within nature which, despite lacking the conscious intention of a breeder, nevertheless statistically influence rates of reproductive success or failure on the basis of traits, which is all a breeder actually does. And so it's similar by analogy. The intentionality aspect is simply not required or relevant. That's the basic point of the book, which you say that you understood after your 5th reading, and I'm starting to worry that you're very, very mistaken about that.
The fundamental basic ingredient, if you want to call it that ingredient, in breeding is the breeder. You take him off, you have no breeding.
Yes, you do. That stud horse isn't just doing what he's doing because you're there. This is not a peer pressure scenario. Animals are going to breed regardless of what you do. Now, of course, the breeding won't go the way the breeder wants it to if there's no breeder, obviously, but it'll go some way or another. Some animals will manage, some animals won't. Whether they do or don't is going to depend in some way on what kind of a situation they're in, and over time, inevitably, the population will be altered in ways that nobody intended or predicted, including the breeding animals themselves. See, you're putting the cart before the horse here. Animal husbandry was not the invention of reproductive success or failure affecting populations. It was the harnessing by humans to their own advantage of that fact that already was true. To say otherwise is kind of like saying that the possibility of fire burning things wasn't a fact about reality until humans started cooking their food.
So your whole breeding experiment crashes.
Yes, if you're intentionally breeding animals in a certain way for some experiment, and then you disappear, your experiment is going to crash. But unless you have the animals trapped in separate places where they can't reach each other, the breeding isn't going to stop. Nor is the fact that no matter what, which animals breed and which ones survive is dependent on external conditions, regardless of whether those external conditions are the interference of another animal, like a human refusing to allow a particular pair to mate, or a lion killing one of the pair before they can, or the interference of anything else. The difficulty of accessing food, or escaping predators, or staying warm, or the preferences of a potential mate. Nature doesn't just grind to a halt without the interference of some intentional actor with a goal of its own. It keeps going, and by that fact alone, change is inevitable. Change is part of what it is to be alive at all.
When he took the whole principle to nature, he could not find a breeder, so he simply left it out.
Okay, you did not read this book. Not 5 times, not 1 time. Or if you did, you have no idea what you read. You're talking as if Darwin went into this with the goal to find some grand breeder who pairs some animals up and lets them reproduce with each other and keeps other animals apart because it wants those animals to produce offspring that suit its own preferences. And apparently this was somehow the central thesis of the book. And Darwin, in his embarrassment at having failed to find this being, carefully wrote the rest of the book hoping nobody would notice that he'd omitted its entire point. And then for incomprehensible reasons, he still published it. Is this what you're expecting me to believe here? Okay, dude, I don't think you've ever laid a hand on this book. Yeah, you know the name of the first chapter. Great. That doesn't change the fact that you're clueless about everything else.
If you put a breeder there, you don't have your theory, because a breeder here is the agent called God.
Yeah, no kidding. If the entire history of life is just artificial selection by God, you don't have natural selection. Go figure. What does that have to do with the book? At no point is the idea that natural selection requires artificial selection. The only reason for bringing up artificial selection is to show how changes can be affected by reproductive success or failure, and to help to illustrate the idea of natural selection by analogy to something that's better understood. But you're talking about that as if that means they should be the same idea, which they're not, and they don't need to be. Why would they? Look, I know you're a creationist, so I don't hold you to high standards, but even by creationist standards, you're demonstrating a shocking level of failure to grasp the point.
So he has destroyed it in that sense. In another sense, he has destroyed it here again.
No, stick with the first sense. What was the destruction? Was it seriously just he mentioned artificial selection, and therefore natural selection can't be natural? Was that supposed to be your point? How do you think that's a point?
He says that selection, natural selection, that's the word people use, natural selection. The word selection
implies a selector. Please don't make me be right about that. Don't just do the same supposed point a second time.
If I gave you a basket of 10 apples and I said select, how many will you have?
How many are you going to let me select? Normally I'd be polite and just take one or two, but from you I'll take them all if I can get away with it. I think that's entirely fair. I think you owe me some apples for making me endure this.
You'll have less.
So I'm allowed to select apples as long as it's less than 10, despite that never having been specified.
Think, selection must result in actually less than what there is.
I really don't think I agree with that. I think that you could still select all 10 of 10 apples, as long as you explicitly chose each of the 10 apples. You see what I'm saying? But yes, I understand what you're driving at in more of a pragmatic sort of sense.
The word natural selection must actually come to less. The maximum it can have is equal.
Oh, there you go. So you agree with me. You can select all 10.
Which again, that's not really selection, that's grabbing.
That doesn't mean anything.
So now look at the amount of genetic material that we have in the smallest organisms. In the viruses, for example.
I wouldn't say a virus is an organism. I know what you're driving at, so I'm just kind of nitpicking, but that's what I'm supposed to do.
I'll tell you how much they are. The genetic material is 500,000 units.
Okay, oddly specific. The viruses is quite a range. But sure, let's go for that number, because I can already tell I don't care.
In the human, now this has been going up, until we come to the humans. The Homo sapien has 3 billion units.
So base pairs then. By units you mean base pairs. I figured, but now I know. So what's the argument then? Ooh, look, number big.
How can selecting from 500,000 reach you to 3 billion? You can't. In fact, the word selection itself is an absolute block to evolution.
Are you stupid? Why do I even ask? Yeah, if nothing ever happened to the genome, if no additions ever occurred, if there was some hard cap on the number of base pairs an organism could have of 500,000, and you never got so much as a single organism with 500,001 base pairs, then yeah, there would not be any organisms with more than that number of base pairs to select from. But seeing as how that's not the case at all, who cares? Why are you even bringing this up? Well, because apparently the word selection absolutely blocks evolution. Well, yeah, if selection is occurring with no change ever occurring, but that's not the reality. Basically, all you're saying is that in your preferred fantasy land, where there's no variation for natural selection to act on, natural selection doesn't act. Oh, great. Yeah, we never thought of that one. Better go back to the drawing board.
If you select, you can't have more than what there is.
Look, I know it's been a while since I really got into it with a creationist, yeah? But I don't think this is just me being unaccustomed to it. I think this is genuinely, really exceptionally bad even for a creationist, right?
Unless you add.
Okay, to his credit, at least he did eventually get to that unless. So he does at least understand that conceptually. That's an improvement from 5 seconds ago. Not by much, of course.
Now, there was a very
And we cut to the audience looking like they're desperate to leave. The guy in the back's chewing his nails waiting to get out of here.
important landmark decision that was made in 1980 by the evolutionary scientists who met in Chicago.
Okay, so this was a meeting at the Chicago Field Museum of Natural History on the topic of macroevolution, and it was immediately a favorite thing of creationists, and seemingly to some extent still is. And that's because Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge were there, proponents of punctuated equilibrium, which of course to some extent challenges gradualism, and the press did what the press does and sensationalized everything into total nonsense. For example, this excerpt from Discover magazine that shows up in Stephen Jay Gould's book, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory, page 982. Charles Darwin's brilliant theory of evolution, published in 1859, had a stunning impact on scientific and religious thought and forever changed man's perception of himself. Now, that hallowed theory is not only under attack by fundamentalist Christians, but is also being questioned by reputable scientists. Among paleontologists, scientists who study the fossil record, there is growing dissent from the prevailing view of Darwinism. Or as Gould himself says on page 983, some absurdly hyped popular accounts simply proclaimed the death of Darwinism, with punctuated equilibrium as the primary assassin, rather than reporting the more accurate but less arresting news about extensions and partial revisions. For example, the same Newsweek article, he mentioned this before, stated that some scientists are still fighting a rearguard action on behalf of Darwinism, and it is no wonder that scientists part reluctantly with Darwin. So yeah, just a pointless nothing burger blown up by the press and then blown up by creationists into something it never was. There's absolutely no reason to be talking about this 45 years later. And the fact that you just said a landmark decision was made there implies that you're going to say something really dumb about it now.
The fundamental question was, can the small changes actually accumulate so that we have a big change?
No, it wasn't. Did you just see that it was on the topic of macroevolution, and then you just assumed that what they must have been talking about with regard to macroevolution was whether it happens at all, or if it's even possible? What a phenomenally pointless assumption to make.
The small changes is called microevolution, and the big change is called macroevolution. Can the small changes add? And they realize there's no mechanism of adding at all.
Okay, so you're just going to make things up out of whole cloth. At that point, why even bother referencing a real meeting? I guess to give it some kind of grounding in reality, but nobody watching this crap is going to know that.
Natural selection is only selection. What you need in evolution is selection plus adding.
Which has literally nothing to do with what you just said the meeting was about, which is whether small variations, variations that are acknowledged implicitly in that sentence to exist, in other words, the adding is already acknowledged to happen, so whether small changes, microevolution, produced by natural selection acting on those variations, can compound over a long period of time into much larger variations. I'm not talking about the actual meeting. That's what you said the meeting was about. And now you're saying, no, it was actually about whether the number of base pairs in DNA can increase. Make up your mind, perhaps.
But there's no mechanism at all, in fact.
It must be really nice to be able to just say things and have no concern about whether you're right. When I get stuff wrong, I feel like a dumbass. But every word out of your mouth is false. And you appear not to be self-conscious about it at all. It's a level of not giving a damn that sometimes I envy.
There's a quote by Charles Darwin himself.
Yeah, let's do it. Quote mine something from more than a century and a half ago. That'll fill time.
When we descend to the details.
Okay, I'll just read it because I don't want these clips to run on too long. When we descend to the details, we cannot prove that a single species has changed, nor can we prove that the supposed changes were beneficial, which is the groundwork of the theory. Life and Letters of Charles Darwin, Volume 1, page 210. Now, I don't know where he's getting that, because that's not where this is from. This is from Volume 2 of Life and Letters of Charles Darwin, in a letter to George Bentham, who was a botanist, on May 22nd, 1863. so like 3.5 years after the publication of Origin of Species, and it's from the postscript to that letter, where he says, "In fact, the belief in natural selection must at present be grounded entirely on general considerations. First, on its being a vera causa from the struggle for existence, and the certain geological fact that species do somehow change. 2, from the analogy of change under domestication by man's selection." This, of course, is the analogy that we discussed a whole bunch before. Really, it's where the term selection comes from in natural selection at all, which itself is basically an analogy or metaphor, maybe. It's not literally selection, as selection implies some sort of intent. 3, and chiefly from this view, connecting under an intelligible point of view a host of facts. In other words, that it has explanatory power. When we descend to details, we can prove that no one species has changed, and then there's a clarification by Francis Darwin, which is actually kind of useful because Charles Darwin phrased this a little bit awkwardly. The meaning is not that they're able to prove that no species has changed. The meaning is that they're unable to prove that a species has. It goes on, "Nor can we prove that the supposed changes are beneficial," which is the groundwork of the theory. "Nor can we explain why some species have changed and others have not." So Darwin was fully aware that in his time, there was a serious lack of understanding, and while there was some evidence for his theory, it left a lot to be desired at that time. The Origin of Species was him laying out the fact that this makes sense, it's coherent, it appears to be a powerful explanation, and in principle it's plausible. The effectiveness of artificial selection, and the ability to apply its principles to nature by analogy, show that much. But as it goes with new ideas, there was a lot to be done, which is where the story of the subsequent almost 2 centuries comes in, which isn't worth getting into. But the fact that you keep going back to Darwin implies that you have no understanding or interest in the development and the support for this basic idea over time. You seem to think that Darwin's book and letters are some sort of evolutionist scripture, and that they should contain the entirety of evolutionary theory, with a perfect description of its every detail, and the entirety of all possible evidential support. This is idiocy. I don't know if you're being dense on purpose or if you're really just like this, but either way, this is really, really sad.
I have stated it verbatim. If these are the words of Charles Darwin, he has destroyed his own theory flat. There's nothing left.
Fortunately, at this moment, the host jumps in to interrupt and basically tells this guy to shut up so they can get on to something else.
This could be another episode.
Well, if he's done with it, so am I. Even by creationist standards, that was something else. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please do give the video a like and click subscribe if you haven't. And if you like the channel, please do consider supporting. I don't take sponsorships. I have the privilege of being able to rely on my audience, and I'm hugely thankful for that. I got a second child on the way. By the time this is published, that one will already probably be here, or almost at least. So some of your dollars go towards diapers and stuff. Not the most exciting, perhaps, but still important. Anyway, email list.logicked.com, and I'll see you next time.